Russell Moore, Curtis Chang, and David French create an unholy trinity and produce the Afterparty, one of the most disgusting attempts to emasculate and radicalize the Christian church toward progressivism in my lifetime. We'll talk about how today on Indie Thinker. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget, we are knee-deep in one of the most important documentaries, I believe, of our time on the fatherlessness epidemic in America. If you want to see the full trailer for the film that we have at this point in time with Dennis Prager, Douglas Wilson, and Warren Farrell, and others, then I highly recommend that you sign up for our newsletter. You can do that by going to the link on the screen. Not only will you gain access to great Indie Thinker content extras, but you'll also see the full trailer that we have at this point in time in our early stages of production, and it's fantastic. I'm telling you, what we have to expose in this fatherless documentary will help change the future of America, but we need your help to do that, because also by subscribing to the newsletter, you'll access ways to help support the film so that we can finish this thing and bring it to production so each and every one of you can enjoy it. So again, go to the link on the screen or go to the description of this podcast where you can find a way to subscribe to our newsletter where you'll gain access to the full trailer of Fatherless. Alistair Begg is a well-known evangelical pastor, and he recently came under fire for comments he made in a podcast where he instructed a grandmother to attend her trans grandson's wedding only after she had acknowledged the sinfulness of the marriage to the couple. Now, you can argue that she shouldn't have been there at all, and I would agree with that, or maybe that the only way she could attend it is by clearly stating to everybody in attendance that she had an issue with this from a moral perspective, and so rightfully Begg was skewered online for his comments on that podcast. And there was no small amount of backlash, including that he was excluded from upcoming speaking engagements and even kicked off radio broadcasts. While the backlash is totally understandable, it's also important to note that the kind of outrage that was displayed over the subject of transgenderism with Alistair Begg is somewhat easy, low-hanging fruit, because it is deplorable what the trans agenda is doing to especially kids, but just people in general in America. But it's also important to note that Alistair Begg has been perfectly clear on where he stands on human sexuality in the past.
When Paul says in Philippians 2, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, that's not an expression of devotion. That is an expression of his identity. What he's doing there, he's saying everybody will finally understand this. So if I understand that Jesus is Lord, then I have no freedom to believe anything other than what he taught. Therefore, I can't re-engineer human sexuality. Then I cannot redefine human marriage. He is Lord. I don't have any option. Please be kind to me. I'm stuck with this. This is all I can do. I'm committed. I have a Lord and I have a master, and this is what he says. I know you find it distasteful, but this is my position, and it's my position because I have a master. Of course, if you don't have a master, you can change your position all the time, and that's exactly what they were doing. We're not free to believe what we want. We're not free to behave as we choose, and that's what they did. Either you will bring your morality into line with God's law, or you will subvert God's law to bring it into line with your morality.
Now, if Andy Stanley ever grows a backbone and ever says anything like what Alistair Begg just said there, please let me know, because I have a couple of mea culpas to come up with, and I'll be the first to make those, but I won't hold my breath expecting that. So acknowledging that Begg has been right on this issue for years is not that hard. I hope we can discern the difference between Begg's unwise comments and the wicked and deceptive manipulation of the creators of the Afterparty, as we'll look at it today. Because once you realize what those guys are up to, you'll realize that your indignation and loathing does not belong to Begg, but rather to Curtis Chang, Russell Moore, David French, and here is just a taste of why.
Because the Sunday morning sermon is actually a really bad way to deal with something like politics. It's one-to-many communication. It's limited. People are bound to misunderstand even, a small thing you say. People will filter what you're saying through their existing political biases. In 30 minutes, I guarantee you, if you go up on Sunday morning in most congregations and you try to preach the one sermon on politics that you haven't been preaching on for a long time, your Monday morning inbox is going to be an ugly scene. And that's honestly why most pastors, or many pastors, don't preach on politics on Sunday morning, because they instinctively know my Monday morning inbox is going to look awful if I do that. So the challenge we need is to give churches and pastors a way to head in towards healthy Christian politics that doesn't force them to preach this magical Sunday morning sermon that will solve everything. And the Afterparty is our attempt to do that, so that you don't have to do all the heavy lifting, and also, frankly, you don't have to take the bullseye, right? Because this way, if you run the Afterparty in your small group community, in your Bible studies and so forth like that, then if people get mad, they get mad at Curtis, Russell, and David. They get less mad at you. You can have plausible deniability, right?
Said the spider to the fly, just don't make any noise, this won't take long. So in what world exactly are we called not to offend people? Doesn't the truth by nature of what it is offend people? Didn't Jesus offend people? Isn't our culture so bankrupt that one sliver of truth can't help but agitate people who have been trained to think more like Taylor Swift than like Jesus? But please allow me to enlighten you. It wasn't the goal of Jesus not to offend people, and it shouldn't be yours. Truth by its very nature is an offensive enterprise. So what Chang is peddling here is nothing but soft soap, progressivism that can't hope to save or help anyone. But you should know that the premise is not just mentally and spiritually devoid of any biblical centricity. The whole origin story of this enterprise with the Afterparty is wrought with disgusting implications. New York Times columnist David French, Duke consulting professor Curtis Chang, and Christianity Today's Russell Moore were exposed for their evil work in Tam Alberta's book, The Kingdom and the Power and the Glory. In it, it shows that these men exchanged their souls for hundreds of thousands of dollars from far left-wing secular group Rockefeller Philanthropy to create the Afterparty. Who is Rockefeller Philanthropy? Well, great question. The group is a radical left-wing secular organization that funded the Afterparty in the same round that they also funded a radical LGBTQ group, an abortion group, and a group dedicated to confusing and mutilating small children in the name of gender ideology. Don't worry, it gets better, because Chang and his minions were also funded by an ecumenical group called, by the way, beware of the word ecumenical nowadays. But this group is called One America Movement. The group's board includes the leader of an LGBTQ affirming synagogue, as well as the co-founder of Black Lives Matter of Greater New York, who excuses rioting as self-defense and has called Jesus a black radical revolutionary.
Y'all have any faith, bruh.
The creators of the Afterparty were happy to overlook their funders' spiritual bankrupt affiliations and the fact that these supposedly Christian men had shared goals with these far-left radicals. Not once did they pause to question any of this. They took the money and sold out their faith and the people they hoped to dupe into consuming their bankrupt content. This is why I hope you've saved the greatest portion of your outrage, not for Begg, but for these men, as I'll show you today in the launch party for the Afterparty.
We want to explain to all of you who are sort of right with us in this key moment more about the Afterparty, but just a word about the very title, the Afterparty. This is a title that has a lot of different meanings. It has some theological meanings that we're going to unpack throughout this whole experience. But in the cultural context, what the Afterparty refers to is, say, you'll have this big, flashy public event, like, say, the Emmys that just happened. People realize that's the big, flashy event. That's what people are all paying attention to. It's after that event is over, that's when the celebrities go to their own private Afterparty, and that's when they relax, their hair comes down, they're off camera, and they can really gather around and have actual meaningful conversations where they're really themselves. That's what we envision for the Afterparty. In this political season, there will be big, flashy public events, which gets all the cameras, like the primary that just happened in Iowa. We think where the real meaningful conversations are going to happen are when Christians gather together and really gather together to have meaningful conversations centered on Jesus. And that's what the Afterparty project is really trying to help us achieve. And a key person that's been crucial for us has been my co-host here, Russell Moore. Russell is the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. And when David and I, when we we had the idea first to start the after party, but we knew there was one person we had to get, and that was Russell. And I remember when David told me that Russell signed aboard, we just sort of like, we did it like, yes, it's going to happen. So Russell, tell us, what has it been like for you to work on this project? Because at least from my vantage point, it's been so fun to get to know you doing this.
Well, I was telling somebody the other day, our original title, you remember, was the Post-Partisan Church. And I said, that's because Curtis and David and I are nerds.
We're nerds.
We needed Nancy French, David's wife, who said, no, the after party. And she was really on to something.
If I were to choose an after party, it wouldn't be Chang's and Moore's, it would be Coffee Brown's. But I do think the name is absolutely fitting for these men, because we all know what happens at the Oscars after party. That's where the cameras go away and the devils can come out to play. That's where the underage human trafficking takes place, the drugs come out, and all sorts of other debauchery takes place lurking in the shadows of the after party. And that is exactly what is taking place with this after party, where these men can operate in the shadows and their true intentions can be covered with flowery language of unity and trying to avoid polarization. While they cover up their true intentions with these kind of flowery words, I will show you what they're really after at the after party.
Well, one of the fun things about the after party that we really like is that we are trying to give people a way to locate themselves in politics other than this, the boring standard divisive categories of right versus left, Republican versus Democrat. And we really wanted to help people locate themselves really by their spiritual posture. And we came up with these categories of the combatant, the exhausted, and the cynic. So the combatant, and one of the fun things about these categories is we realized among the three of us that we actually played, like in real life, we occupied one of these roles. So David French, maybe not surprised to folks who know him, he was the combatant. I am the cynic, even though Russell didn't believe me at first. I really am the cynic.
I still don't believe you, but
no. All right. But Russell was the exhausted, and we wanted to open this webinar by sharing with you a segment from the actual course, the after party, where Russell explains his identity as the exhausted. So let's play that clip now.
I find myself when I'm talking to someone who's been around for a long time or someone who's an expert in some area of history or sociology, I'll find myself asking, have things always been this crazy? Is this just life and I'm just noticing it? Or are we in a really unique time? And so far, to the person, they have said, this is a unique time. There's something very different about this moment that we're in right now. The exhausted person often starts to wonder, am I the one who is out of step and out of touch because I can't see what a lot of people around me seem to see? Of the categories that we're dealing with in this time together, I most identify with the exhausted. And I think that's because I'm a disappointed idealist, a broken-hearted idealist. And I think when that happens, there ultimately can be a sense of being overwhelmed. A key reason why I think people move into the exhausted phase is that anyone can endure almost anything for a little while. So if someone thinks I'm pressing through this conflict or craziness or whatever is happening for a little while, they can do it. It's when a person starts to think, oh, this is now the new normal, that a person can be overwhelmed by that. One of the reasons idealists are often brokenhearted is, first of all, because we live in a fallen world. And so everything is going to lead to brokenheartedness at some level or the other. But even beyond that, there often comes the realization not just that people don't live up to their ideals, but that they never really held them. You start to get to the point where you realize maybe the ideals that we held together as a group were just about group belonging. They didn't actually transcend the group. So when the group moves to a different place, a different set of ideals are then used. And a person can always find a reason to rationalize that. Our ideals have changed because the people we're opposing are so much worse, or the situation we're dealing with is so much worse. But the ideals then start to become part of group identity rather than what the group is moving toward.
All right, so Moore tells us he's an exhausted idealist. Now, let me first kind of go with the exhausted part here, and then we'll jump into the rest of his claim. Supposedly, the Afterparty is at least in part trying to reach people who feel exhausted, and Moore calls himself an exhausted idealist. We'll get to Moore in just a moment, but let me at first address the idea of being exhausted. Listen, I understand that in the midst of a cultural battle, which you should be well aware we are in full swing a part of right now, and Christians have a role to play in that cultural battle, I can understand a bit of exhaustion, but let me please implore you, let me please tell you that I understand that you get tired of the posting on social media, you get tired of the constant criticism and the cynical takes on things, and you get tired of people wagging their fingers and all of that. But we also must understand that in the midst of the mess of everything that can get us very exhausted is a very important cultural battle that matters not only for you, but also for the future of your children. So I understand exhaustion, but please wipe the sweat away and get back in the fight. We need you, and your fighting actually makes a big difference, so you cannot afford to be exhausted right now. So forgive me if I think that the Afterparty's desire to try to help people who are exhausted seems a little bit misplaced, especially when we hear that Russell Moore is an exhausted idealist. Let me tell you what Russell Moore is. He is not an exhausted idealist. Russell Moore is a liar. And so you know that I am not just merely throwing ad hominem attacks at people, but I have justification for this. Please let me enlighten you with a couple of clips. First, this.
You know, I mentioned to you the other day that I have a list that I sort of keep in Google Keep of milestone dates. So that I can sort of think about, oh, well, this is the date of my baptism, or this is the date of some significant thing happening. One of those dates is October the 7th. Because this was the day in 2016 when the Access Hollywood tape released with a candidate for president talking in really, really shockingly crude and violent, I would say, terms about women.
So the implication there that we are supposed to believe is that Russell Moore has a cloud where he stores important dates for his life. He's got his kid's baptism, the date he was married, and other important events in his life, but also stored in that cloud is the date where Donald Trump said, grab them by the P word. So that's one of the most important dates in the life of Russell Moore. Please, excuse me if I do not believe a word that comes out of that man's mouth. If he is telling the truth, he is one of the biggest losers in all of human history, because that is hardly that important of a date. But I don't think he is telling the truth. I simply think he's saying this for shock value or to try to prove a point. But his lying doesn't stop there. He also goes on to stir up racial animosity with this lie.
Which means sometimes I think asking people in your community, what's going on with our church? I had a friend who was talking to a pastor in Alabama who was serving a white church in a predominantly African-American community. And the pastor said, I just don't know why we can't get black people to come to our church. And he's seated at a desk. Behind him is a Confederate flag and a bust of Stonewall Jackson. He said, well, maybe that's a clue.
Perhaps.
You know, maybe.
Let me just tell you that I've preached for the last 22 years in mostly rural country churches all over the Southeast. And never once have I met a pastor who has a bust of Stonewall Jackson in his office and a Confederate flag in his office. You know why I've never met that person? Because they don't exist. And Russell Moore didn't meet that person either. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't racist people out there and also people who are so confused as to think that you can be a Christian and also be a racist. I think I might have met some of those pastors in the past, but none of them are so explicit as to absolutely throw their ministry away by having a Confederate flag in their office and a bust of Stonewall Jackson. Not to mention, the guys who do that aren't interested in diversity in their church. So they're not confused if they were to have that kind of stuff in their office, but of course they are not, because Russell Moore is lying. He's lying about everything that he just said. He is not an exhausted idealist. By the way, if you are an idealist, you understand, if anything, that ideas have consequences, and if so, you cannot afford to be exhausted if you're a Christian, because you have a responsibility to stand up against bad ideas. So again, wipe the sweat off your brow, get back into the fray, and actually stand for truth. But that isn't what Russell Moore wants you to believe, because he's not an exhausted idealist, he is a liar. What he's really saying is this, he is a progressive Christian, and he wants to twist and pervert the Christian church toward progressivism. Russell Moore is a lifelong Democrat and probably has never voted Republican. He doesn't like conservatives, and he doesn't like conservatism. So what Moore wants to do is actually push the church to become silent on the issues that matter most, so that he can try to convince them to become more progressive, and so that those more vocal, outspoken progressives can have their way in the church. I don't know about you. I sure know from me, I will not sit back and allow these kind of lies to be peddled. But Russell Moore wants that. That's why he's lying about all of this stuff. That's why he's lying about being an exhausted idealist. All he is a progressive Democrat, and he wants to pervert and twist the goal of the church in order to match his progressive priors. And in a little bit, I'll show you why that's so damaging and so unbiblical. Because when we start to stack up where the church kind of sits politically, I will show you why conservatism is the better choice. We do not sell out to conservatism, but if you're sold out to Christianity, you will inevitably be a conservative. Russell Moore knows this. He's smart enough to realize it, and that's why he wants to blackmail you into silence by suggesting that the reason you're so exhausted is because you're a Christian that's involved in this culture war, and you're probably, picking up these conservative values along the way, maybe because you're so obsessed with Donald Trump that you can't think for yourself. And ultimately, the cure for your exhaustion is just to shut up, listen to me, and become more progressive. Well, I'm not buying it. And I'm not also buying the next thing he wants to talk about, which is that he's not just worried about the exhaustion of fellow Christians, but he's also worried about the exhaustion of pastors and Christian leaders. And the real way, obviously, to avoid that exhaustion and to avoid any sticky situations in church that we can't afford to get into, because we know the goal of the church is never to proclaim the truth, it's just to appease people. So in order to avoid that exhaustion, you need to follow the prescription that Russell Moore has for you here. So let's hear what he has to say to the local church and to pastors.
Russell, you talked in the video about how it gets especially exhausting when you feel this sense of this political animosity is hitting us over and over and it won't end. And I think about us as individuals. I think a lot about it also as pastors. We have a lot of pastors, I think, who are on this webinar, and what they've had to endure the last two election cycles, 2016 and then 2020, was really hard on pastors, as they had to deal with congregations that were increasingly divided. And then the thought of now 2024 having to go through that again, that's exhausting. What would you say to those the pastors here for a moment? What is our answer to that sense of exhaustion? Because that can be, like you said, be really, really draining.
Well, and the interesting thing about it is it doesn't really matter where on the political spectrum a pastor is, or often where on the political spectrum a congregation is. You will have the same sorts of conversations. I had a conversation just the other day with a very, very conservative Texas evangelical pastor, and then a progressive urban pastor. And both were saying the same thing, which is, I actually agree with most of the politics of the people in my congregation, but the problem is, if I don't make it central, then it becomes an issue. Or if I don't make somebody's particular issue central, then it becomes an issue, and they're ground down by that. And so that is happening all over the place. I was talking to a group of pastors one time. I'll probably never forget the conversation, because a pastor in the room said, "What do you think it is about 2021, the year 2021, that broke so many of us?" And a pastor in the room said, "I think it's because up until then, we thought we were pressing through something. So 2016 election is really divisive. Let's get to 2017. And then it's COVID, pandemic, those sorts of questions, really, really divisive. Let's press through that, through the 2020 election, through, you just keep going through these things." And there came a point, and this pastor identified it with 2021, where people started to realize, wait, we're not waiting for something to end. This is what the world looks like right now.
Big reason why in the Afterparty we are wanting to recenter on Jesus, to place our hopes not in an election cycle or an election outcome, but on the eternal promises of Jesus that transcend the election cycle. And this is where the call to hope is so important for the exhausted. There's another call in addition to the call to hope, which is that we make in the Afterparty, which is the call to humility. Russell, talk about why the pairing of these two, hope and along with humility, is so important in this moment.
Well, I think one part of it is the ability to want to actually connect with people who are different. And I think it's really difficult when we're in a time when it's really similar in some ways to the world that Jesus walked into, which is, why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? We just redefine who the tax collectors and sinners are all the time. So why are you engaging with or talking with this person with whom you disagree? Aren't you signaling that you've lost your ideals? And that's just not the case. But also because we're able to hold a sense of, I might be wrong on a lot of issues, which causes you to walk forward in a little bit different way. But also it causes you to give some grace to the people you're engaging with, because we understand how it is that we, even when we want to persuade each other, we understand how that happens, and it doesn't happen by overpowering somebody.
Yeah, and it seems like so much of the difficulty with people adopting a posture of humility in politics is they think, well, if I do that, I'll just lose. I'll get run over. I need to maintain a position of strength. And yet the posture of a disciple isn't out to win. They're out to follow Jesus. They're out to become more like Jesus. And so this is why in the Afterparty, we so much talk about, we want to be disciples. We don't, out of our various postures of being combatant, being cynical, or being exhausted, all three of those postures, we're trying to become more like Jesus. We're trying to be disciples.
So what we've heard thus far from Russell Moore and Curtis Chang is, and this is kind of a paraphrase, but I think this is faithful to what they said. You pastors, you're exhausted right now because you've been discipling your people into political ideology for far too long, and you need to start doing what we do, which is disciple your people into hope and humility, which obviously means never taking a controversial stand on anything, which is kind of weird if you ever read the Bible. Now, I know there's a large portion of you, maybe even watching this right now, who are not Christians, or maybe you are and you're kind of in the deconstruction camp, or maybe just kind of in the wishy-washy camp of Christianity, and you've been told for the longest time the one thing that Christians cannot afford to be is called intolerant. Of course, Jesus never preached tolerance in any of his messages and any of his ministry. Don't be judgmental. That's the one thing you can't be. You can cheat on your wife, you can be addicted to substance, you can be totally obsessed and addicted to Netflix or whatever it may be. But the one thing you cannot afford to be is judgmental. Of course, we are, as Christians, called to be judgmental as it pertains to morality. When a man cheats on his wife, we don't say, hey man, it's okay, we just want to disciple you into hope and humility. No, if you love that person and really care about that person, you say, hey man, this is sinful, let's figure out how to fix this sin. That's what true love looks like. And by and large, the church has been avoiding those things for the longest time. Now, Russell Moore and Chang don't want you to believe that. They want you to think that pastors have just been busying themselves with this endless litany of political talking points. By and large, the church for multiple generations now has been a victim, I will say, or at least the participant of an ideology, and that is the seeker-sensitive movement, which has convinced us to stay away from sticky topics and to avoid those things at all costs because we can't afford to be equated to the moral majority or to those who want to talk about political things or difficult subjects. What we need to do is we just need to love people. That's the seeker-sensitive ideology that has been proliferating in the church for the longest time. And this is essentially what Chang and Moore are really trying to push on us. What Chang and Moore offer here is this luciferian bargain. Chang and Moore want to prey upon the fears of pastors who want to hang on to their people at all costs and are so desperately afraid of losing them. They want to prey upon those fears and say, hey, you're going to lose your people if you ever talk about difficult subject. You ever talk about human sexuality? You ever talk about abortion? You ever talk about transgenderism from the pulpit? Well, guess what's going to happen? People are going to misperceive you. And so they say, in a sense, don't worry, just be quiet. This won't take long, said the spider to the fly. So this Luciferian bargain is simply this: sell out the truth to make people happy. For a while at least, until they realize you've ensnared them into a weak church that can be run over by the program of the cultural Marxist and postmodern malcontents. This always has been Satan's kind of tactic from the very beginning. It's been his offer, and it's sad when Christian men are so deceived, or they're wolf in sheep's clothing, and they come along to deceive others and say exactly what Curtis Chang and Russell Moore and David French are after in the Afterparty. Let me just be really clear with you. Clear language on the issues that matter most, the issues of our day, the issues of importance. Those issues actually, when they're talked about and expressed from the pulpit, from pastors, don't create exhaustion. What they create is clear on-ramps for people who are not Christians, who understand what it means to be a Christian, who understands this is what you're called to. If we don't do that, then ultimately we have a generation of people who believe that they are Christians and they're actually not. Now, this is actually something that has happened to me in the past, but I use it as an analogy. What do you say to the young girl maybe who comes to you and says, well, I'm praying right now about whether or not me and my boyfriend should have a baby. I really want God's will on this issue. And so, we've been fornicating, my word, not theirs. We've been fornicating, and so I really just want God's will in terms of whether or not we should go ahead and have a baby. Well, of course, we all know the biblical thing to do is to get married and then to have children. This girl is deeply confused about what it actually means to be a Christian, and you must ask yourself as an honest person, what's created that? Maybe it's her, maybe it's a her issue, maybe it's a her thing, but maybe it's a church thing, maybe it's an us thing. That the reason there are so many people deceived as to what it means to be a Christian is because we haven't clearly created on-ramps for people to understand what it means to be a Christian. So can you be a pro-pronoun using, pro-trans, pro-homosexual, pro-abortion Christian? The answer to that is no. You can't. Now, you can get saved and you can still have some of those old habits, but if you're truly being discipled, you're not being discipled into just purely hope and humility. You're being discipled into morality that will help you realize the error of your ways. This is how Christians truly make a difference in the world. This is how Christians create utility for a world that is steeped in cultural Marxism and postmodernism that says your truth and my truth, rather than the truth. And people right now are experiencing high degrees of mental illness, suicidality, and much more because the existential anchor that Christianity has offered to generations in the past is being totally replaced with secularism. So if there is an exhaustion today, it is that the church is not stepping up to the plate and doing what they are supposed to do. And we'll see how we really need to be doing this in this final clip from the Afterparty.
And it seems like so much of the difficulty with people adopting a posture of humility in politics is they think, well, if I do that, I'll just lose. I'll get run over. I need to maintain a position of strength. And yet the posture of a disciple isn't out to win. They're out to follow Jesus. They're out to become more like Jesus. And so this is why in the Afterparty, we so much talk about we want to be disciples. We don't, out of our various postures of being combatant, being cynical or being exhausted. All three of those postures, we're trying to become more like Jesus. We're trying to be disciples. But that phrase, being a disciple, applied to the realm of politics, that may be new or just a new thing for pastors to think that part of their job as disciple makers is to disciple people's politics, not in telling them whether to be, Republican or Democrat, but in how they engage, whether to disciple them into hope and humility. Can you talk more about this blind spot we have of where we sort of carve out politics from the realm of discipleship? Even as pastors, we're tempted to do that.
Well, I think part of it is because initially people think, well, if people are being discipled and in the realm of politics, that means they're being told what their politics should be.
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of that in the history of the church. But actually what we're doing is the same thing that we do with parenting, with technology, with work. We're asking, how does this realm of your life shape you? And how are you carrying the witness of Christ into that very important area? And that's really not a new thing. If you think of when John the Baptist is preaching at the Jordan, there are tax collectors and Roman soldiers who come up and say, okay, I repent. What do I do now? And what John does is not to give them a military policy or a tax policy. It's to say, don't defraud people, don't extort people, don't threaten people. He's talking about how they live out a life in conformity with Christ.
So again, the Afterparty gets it totally wrong here. How do they do so? Well, of course, because when they use the word political, they're using it incorrectly. It's really a misnomer. Whenever you hear the word political, what I want you to think about is the word morality. So Russell Moore's contention here is that as Christians, we're not supposed to come in and kind of mold people's political ideology. We're supposed to mold the manner in which, or the bedside manner of the people who engage in political conversation or who engage in political ideas. So it's just the way you do it that Jesus is only concerned with, but not actually the political ideas that you hold. Of course, there couldn't be anything further from the truth, especially when you take my suggestion. Does Jesus care about your morality? Of course he does. And of course you are supposed to be shaped from your pastor and from other fellow Christians, and obviously from Jesus and the Word of God in terms of your morality. And ultimately, that I want to replace the word political with moral here, because when they mean political, they clearly do not just simply mean tax brackets and maybe some fiscal policy. That's not what they mean. There's an argument, by the way, if some of those things still fall within the realm of morality. They mean the grand political scale of things. And of course, Christians cannot afford to be silent on the issues that matter most. Let me give you for example here. So on the single issue of abortion, yes, your political ideology should be shaped by Jesus, who kind of didn't like that whole murder thing, who kind of said, you mess with a child, that it would be better for you to have a millstone thrown around your neck and thrown into the sea. By the way, those same verses also can double as arguments for why we should also stand politically against transgender ideology. So yes, political ideas do fall within the realm of Christianity, the umbrella of Christianity, when we're talking about moral things. And on those issues, there is no middle ground. And this is where I think it's ridiculous to just suggest that there is really no political stance that Christians have. So say you don't like calling yourself a conservative. Now, I, for one, think conservative probably isn't far right enough for me to really comprise who I am. But let's just say you don't like labels. You're not liberal, you're not conservative, you're a Christian. You just want to call yourself Christian, fine. Whatever. But let's just be honest about who we are for a moment. And let's stack up our beliefs. Do you have the luxury as a Christian to be silent and apolitical when it comes to abortion? No, as a Christian, you have to be on the side of pro-life. Do you have the luxury of doing that when it comes to a definition of marriage? No, of course you don't. It's very clear what the Bible has to say about marriage. What about the mutilation of children in gender clinics all over America, or the shoving of puberty blockers down the throats of 11-year-olds who barely know how to write in cursive and are being told that, hey, we're going to keep your breasts from growing and they'll probably never grow back, even if you decide to get off these puberty blockers. So of course, as you start to stack up all of these moral issues that also cross over into issues of politics, you're going to find slowly but surely, regardless of whether you like calling yourself a conservative or not, that if you're truly a Bible-believing Christian, you're going to find yourself siding very often, if not always, with conservatism. I'm not going to say that our job as Christians is to put a voter registration in the hands of people, but our job as Christians is to shape people morally, and if we do that, it is clear that they will be voting on one side of the aisle, whether you like labels or not. This is why I want to just end by encouraging you to do one simple thing, and it is to, well, maybe two things. One, utterly reject the Afterparty, but take a golden rule of thumb here. While Moore and Chang and French want to encourage you just to be loving and to kind to people and not be divisive and polarizing, never take a stand if it might rub somebody the wrong way. I rather want to encourage you to take the golden rule of thumb here, and that is to do this. Whenever you feel like compassion is in conflict with the truth, go with the truth. Stick with the truth because it is the most compassionate thing you can do at the end of the day. So the easiest way to think about this is if you feel like compassion and truth are in conflict with each other, choose truth. Because if you do the opposite, you'll be doing what Moore and Chang want you to do, and you'll be doing what C.S. Lewis called creating men without chests. Lewis said this in The Abolition of Man. We make men without chests and expect from them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. For the longest time when I read that, I thought C.S. Lewis was saying we need courageous men and bold men, but that's just scratching the surface here. What he's really saying is the thing that connects the intelligence with the appetites is the heart, the thing in the middle space here where the chest is. It's the heart that we need to truly be Christians. In other words, we can't just have an intellectualized, dispassionate faith where we celebrate this kind of after-party Christianity where we're just trying to stand in the middle and we don't really take a firm stance on issues. These are men without chests. That's what C.S. Lewis is talking about. And if Chang and Moore get their way, they will create whole churches of men without chests who are dispassionate about standing for truth. But of course, if you love the truth, if you love Jesus, if you believe he's the way, the truth, and the life, then you cannot afford to do anything other than to take a firm stance, a firm, passionate stance on the truth if you have a heart for truth. If you don't, I fear that it is a recipe for exactly what Russell Moore and his minions want, which is to create the kind of landscape where progressive ideology, cultural Marxism, can flood the church and do exactly what Marx wanted from the very beginning. Why he called religion the opiate of the masses, because he knew that the greatest threat to his revolution was Christians standing for truth in culture. Rather, I would just say this. If you're afraid that maybe the witness of Christianity has been harmed in some way in the past because people have stood for truth, that the real way to reclaim your witness in the public square is not to be a sellout. Ultimately, if you find yourself in the public square after that, you'll have nothing to say. Rather, I would encourage you to realize that the real reason Christians have lost their witness in the public square in the present has nothing to do with intolerance and judgmentalism. It's because we have not spoken the truth authoritatively. We've been men without chests. But if we change that, we can also change the world. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and go with God.